Beth tells me that we're ready to begin, and I'm happy to under her leadership take this lead on this afternoon's panel. Thank you everyone for the opportunity to be back here this afternoon with you on this panel about women, peace and security and opportunities for Canada. I'm happy to be here with Beth, and thank you for your leadership with the network across the country, and with Jacqueline and Mavic, who have tremendous resumes and leadership on this and many other issues, and who I'm here and excited to learn from this afternoon. Just to give everybody a sense of where I come from in talking about international development and assistance and working in developing countries and with women and girls. I had the opportunity in 2010 and 2011 to work with a small NGO in a small West African country of the Gambia, delivering health education to young Gambians, working with an NGO, the Nova Scotia Gambia Association, who were delivering the messaging and education around sexual reproductive health and behavior change, around malaria prevention, and around general human rights. And I was able to witness the tremendous growth that young women in that country had seen over 15 or 20 years of that organization's work on the ground, educating and then empowering young women to take educator roles themselves, working with young girls in communities. And I know that and the establishment of a post-secondary education institute there, and the ability of those young women to go to school has already gone a long way in helping overcome some of the paternalistic history of that area, and also has the potential to lead to tremendous societal and economic growth. So that experience helped me come back to Canada and understand some of the ways that we can always do better to empower women in our communities, and that's perhaps the end that I have to this conversation, with still so much more to learn. I'm tremendously interested today to hear from folks on this panel in this room about some of the challenges ahead of us and gaps that remain in the implementation of this agenda, and also the unique opportunities for Canada to play a leadership role in regards to women, peace, and security. So with that, maybe I'll end my brief opening comments. I'll happy to help answer any questions that people may have, but certainly interested to hear from my colleagues up on the stage as to their contributions to this conversation. So thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Matt. We're really glad to have you back with us this afternoon. It's a real treat actually to have you join us up here, and we look forward to your insights as well as we move forward. So we're very fortunate to have with us today Mavic Cabrera-Vilesa and Jacqueline O'Neill. Mavic is with the Global Network of Women Peace Builders, and she's currently the international coordinator. And Mavic brings an amazing range of experiences to us this afternoon of work at the global level, work on behalf of women's organizations at the Security Council, but also the Global Network of Peace Builders, and maybe we'll get a chance to hear about this tomorrow, has been doing very, very interesting work supporting localization of national action plans on the ground at local level, not just at national level. So she brings a range of experiences to this discussion today. And Jackie O'Neill, who, despite her current residence in Washington, is a Canadian. We will forgive her for being from Edmonton, but anybody from it. You have no allies in the crowd.
Calgary.
But Jackie is what's your title, Jackie? You're the president? At Inclusive Security. For those of you that know Inclusive Security, they have a global expertise in building, supporting, evaluating national action plans on women, peace, and security, and also in supporting women peace builders around the world with capacity, access, training, networking. They've done some very, very interesting work. And if you've had a chance to dig through the background materials, you'll note that the midterm review of the Canadian National Action Plan was done by Inclusive Security about 3 years ago, I think it was. So Jackie brings also a range of experiences to this discussion today, and also a knowledge of the Canadian scene. So the focus of this panel is to look at the global context. Where are we now? It came up a little bit this morning that the previous National Action Plan lacked that sort of being informed by countries experiencing conflict, what the situation on the ground was. So hopefully we can bring that in. We are now almost 17 years since the first Security Council resolution on women, peace, and security was passed. We know that the world has changed in those 17 years. The opportunities are different, the context is different, and so that's what we hope to explore this afternoon. We will get a chance tomorrow to talk specifically about what we learned on National Action Plan. So we could say the National Action Plan discussion for tomorrow, but we're looking at the global context and opportunities for Canada. So we're just going to get the conversation started. And my first question is for Mavic then. Mavic, given that we are now almost 17 years along, can you tell us a little bit about what progress we've made globally on the women, peace, and security agenda, and what you see as the major gaps?
Yeah, I'd like to start positive. And I know you've emphasized that the discussion on national action plans is going to be more focused tomorrow, but I would like to start there as, note of progress, or looking at the glass half full rather than half empty. So there are now 64 national action plans, and there are still over a dozen being drafted or updated. And compared to 2015, this is progress because there were only 53 2 years ago. And I apologize, I'm not starting properly. I just would like to thank the Women, Peace and Security Network Canada for its amazing work, not just today, but many years before this. And I was also privileged to participate in some of the consultations during the first National Action Plan, and WPS Canada, with or without resources, was mobilizing, reaching out, doing monitoring, so thank you so much. And now, of course, the Global Affairs Canada and all the government entities represented here who are supporting this process to ensure that civil society voices are completely integrated into the process. So thank you so much. Thank you for having us here. Now, my real response. It's the policy area where we've seen the most rapid growth at the global level, next only to the issue of children in armed conflict. And as we all know, there are now 8 resolutions. There's 1325, of course, which is the founding document, and the 7 supporting resolutions. But I would like to make note there that at least 4 or 5, actually 5 of the supporting resolutions are focused on sexual violence and conflict. There's a big discussion that we need to set aside on why that is, and we really need to question that. Okay, so the other indicators or evidence of progress is there's now an increased messaging on conflict prevention. And we're very happy to note this because, again, going back to the point about sexual violence, the dominant messaging before 2015 was prevention of sexual violence in conflict, not prevention of violent conflicts themselves. And as a good friend of mine, some of you might know her, Cora Weiss, loved to say, when we only focus on preventing sexual violence and conflict, preventing the use of rape as a weapon of war, then the overarching message there is we're only making war safe for women. It's okay to have war for as long as women are not being violated. And we also believe that for as long as there are conflicts, women will always be vulnerable, especially if they're not in decision-making positions. So, again, going back to the progress, there's an increase in messaging on conflict prevention and coming also from member states. And also the 3 reviews that took place in 2015, the Global Study on 1325, the Peace Operations Review, and the review of the Peace Building Architecture all underscored the need to prevent conflicts themselves. So that was great. And again, in the same 3 reviews, the messaging on the need, the strong need to address the fragmentation in the UN system. Dismantle the silos. That is a very, very good message at the policy level. Other signs of progress are increased efforts in mediation. For example, there's the Nordic Women Peace Mediators Network that is supported by Finland, Sweden, Norway. So that's a good sign also. And the Department of Political Affairs and UN Women updated their joint gender mediation strategy to promote a multi-level, multi-strategy approach to conflict prevention. Another sign of progress is in peace agreements. We know already, I mean, that's why there is 1325, right? That women are underrepresented, if not absent, in official peace processes. When it's informal, unofficial, community level, we know women are there, women are leading it. When it becomes formal and official, they disappear because they're not considered as experts. They're not military experts. They're not former presidents or former ministers. The valuing of their contribution at the community level is not valued the same way when it becomes formal and official. But in the peace agreements facilitated by the UN in 2015, there were 10, by the way, that were signed in 2015. 7 out of those, or 70%, contained gender-specific provisions. Again, comparing, so there's a reference, in 2014, there was only 50% of those peace agreements that contained gender-specific provisions. So some of those countries where those are evident were the agreements in Myanmar, Mali, Colombia, and South Sudan. A few more, Beth, I'm going to wrap up now. A few more progress. The establishment of the Global Acceleration Instrument, which Canada supports. Thank you, Canada. I think maybe the GAC people can correct my figure, but I think it's around $1.5 million Canadian. What is the GAI, or the Global Acceleration Instrument on Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action? It's a pooled funding mechanism that now has funding from 7 countries. The total size of the fund is less than 9 million. It's loose change, really, it's loose change. Compared to the real need, compared to what countries are spending for their defense ministries. But the good news about the GAI is that 50% of the total will go to women's organizations working in conflict-affected communities. 50%. And where the Peace Building Fund, which is another funding mechanism in the UN that is dedicated to peace and security, where the Peace Building Fund is not present, 100% will go to women's organizations working in local communities directly affected by conflict. So that's one really outstanding element of the GAI, but another outstanding element of the GAI is that women civil society, self-selected civil society, I would like to emphasize that, will have a seat in the decision-making structure of the GAI. I see it as one of the four representatives of civil society in the Global Funding Board. And the Global Funding Board, which is the governance and decision-making body, has a counterpart at the national level. So we would like to ensure that that is happening and that self-selection principle is followed. Otherwise, the UN, and with all due respect to our colleagues in the UN and governments, they will appoint their favorite organizations if civil society will not insist on self-selection. Finally, greater intersection between women, peace and security and humanitarian action is also a good development. And the reason being is that humanitarian emergencies are not really short-term. We're not talking of 1 year, 2 year emergencies. People stay in refugee camps for a decade, even more. So if there is no intersection between the response to peace and security and humanitarian action, we'll just see more conflicts and more refugees. And the grand bargain, the outcome document of the World Humanitarian Summit emphasizes that a lot, that the intersection is very important, because only then that there will be a long-term strategy. And this also has an impact on funding, by the way, because usually there's always more funding for humanitarian response, not on women, peace and security, where we demand more women in decision-making, more women's participation in designing response to conflict. So that's another sign of progress. I'll stop here.
Great, thanks, Mavic. So, Jackie, Max talked about some of the improvements at the normative level, the number of Security Council resolutions, some of the changes at the UN, increase in women mediators, some funding mechanism with a voice for civil society, and then her last point on humanitarian. What's your perspective on where we're at now in globally in implementing this agenda?
Okay, I must start by thanking as well the Women, Peace and Security Network, Beth. I've never been in a room with so many members. I read everything that you put out diligently. I think I'm going to talk to Mavic about maybe having a localization project in Alberta for the Women, Peace and Security Network, so we have more Edmontonians in the room next time, but areas to work on for the next snap. Affirmative action, that's right. To the GAC, thanks for hosting this, and Matt, thanks for being here. I think something we know from around the world is that when parliaments are engaged in this subject, and in a national action plan in particular, it has infinitely more traction. So totally significant. To get back to your question, Beth, agree, and I think Mavic did a great job of painting the really broad picture. A couple additional thoughts about the broadening of issues that we're seeing take on a women, peace, and security lens, or that we're seeing the world recognize has a women, peace, and security lens. Countering violent extremism has for a while been what I call somewhat of a shiny object in the international community, particularly in the United States. At the UN, it's called Preventing Violent Extremism. I have enormous fears that this current US administration is going to start permeating or much more pervasively talking about countering Islamic terrorism and shifting US domestic policy in that regard. But countering violent extremism is all the rage. It's what everyone talks about. You could go to a conference a week about women, or about countering violent extremism, and in particular about women, peace, and security and the intersections. And would just say that as this discourse continues, I think we're seeing it fairly, it's not recognizing the multidimensional element of violent extremism and processes of radicalization. And women, peace, and security and countering violent extremism, the discourse is often still very much women are mothers. Mothers have a chance to spot signs of radicalization and report that. Or potentially to dissuade often their sons from joining radical movements. Okay, that's one element. The conversation is much, much broader, including the importance of women being involved in governance structures and inclusive systems that relate to or that can lead to less radicalization in the first place. So there's a much bigger picture related between women, peace, and security as a topic and countering violent extremism that I think is being largely overlooked, and I would say by organizations in the international community. Something really, really important to note, I think, and as we think about developing Canada's national action plan, is the extent to which violent extremist groups are actually exploiting gender dynamics. And so they don't do it with they don't talk about it, they don't have their own national action plans, but they're certainly having very targeted, very deliberate approaches to recruitment, for example. About 1 in 7 foreign fighters from so-called global north or Western nations are female. They're very deliberate recruitment campaigns, so they're having women recruit other women, somewhat sophisticated, although it seems sophisticated in contrast to almost nothing that's going on to counter message, but programs and online recruitment targeting women specifically. And we talked a bit this morning about the narrative of women only as victims of conflict and women deserving only protection. Something that many violent extremist groups are tapping into very in a sophisticated way is recognizing women's desire to have agency and to be agents of change in their community. So they're targeting them very specifically, saying, be part of the caliphate, be part of this movement, be a lioness in your community, realize this broader vision for yourself. So in violent extremist movements, there's a real recognition that gender dynamics, gender differences exist, and a deliberate exploitation of it. Also in places like Colombia, we've been working quite a lot with women in Colombia. Awesome peace agreement with the FARC. 40% of the FARC soldiers, combatants, are female. They're coming back into communities where 1% of the Colombian military is female, and where groups are not necessarily ready to recognize their agency. So they're facing demobilization programs that say become a seamstress or a hairdresser or something like that. Whereas narco-traffickers are saying, hey, look, these are women who understand the terrain, they know signals operation, they're logisticians. This is exactly our target market. So all to say, there are people who are, it seems like we talked about this morning, it's great that an app exists. It's not a luxury to have a strategy on women, peace, and security. Unfortunately, in reality it is, but it shouldn't be, because there are also counter forces that are exploiting these dynamics in really negative ways. A couple of other trends we're seeing, definite increase in focus on climate change as it relates to women and security. I think Norway just added an element of climate change in their national action plan. And then refugees. The refugee crisis in Europe has already affected a lot of work and a lot of programming, especially a lot of funding for international organizations focused on these issues, as European governments in particular, who have been traditionally really robust funders of this agenda, are focusing inward and focusing domestically. And I predict, I have no idea if this is going to be true or not, but that one of the issues that I would say lessens the gap between national action plans that are outwardly focused, like Canada's or many others, and those that are domestically focused, like most countries who are directly affected by conflict, is going to be the refugee crisis. I think you'll see many governments in Europe in particular who haven't revised their national action plans since the refugee crisis really became a real thing, are going to start having to do that domestically, and that's going to further blur the lines, and I think I would argue appropriately so, between these outwardly looking ones and inwardly looking ones. And the last point I'll mention, in addition to the UN, but is a focus on this agenda at multilateral bodies. So the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, has a real focus right now on encouraging its member states to develop national action plans and on supporting them technically to do so. I think about half of their member states or participating nations have national action plans. NATO is increasingly, and you mentioned you're on the NATO Committee on Gender Perspectives, as is Beth, thank you. And we're seeing the creation of a national action plan being put out there as a positive incentive for ascension to NATO membership. So part of this pathway, or Partnership for Peace pathway to NATO, is being described for many countries as develop a national action plan, and that's one of the many components that NATO will be looking for ascension to NATO membership. I should note Canada's ambassador to NATO, Carrie Buck, is awesome. She has, I'm sure as all of you know, she has also done a lot to put women, peace, and security on the agenda of NATO. I think last year she hosted on International Women's Day a high-level discussion session at NATO with NATO heads of mission, ambassadors, to talk about women, peace, and security, and in typical Canadian style also ensured that civil society was present at the conversation. So NATO, things are progressing. The African Union has a special envoy on women, peace, and security, and various other multilateral organizations are looking at this as a way of strengthening domestically the member states that are part of those countries. And I'll stop so you can keep going to other questions.
Super, but do you want to jump in here, Matt? You look like you have a question you'd like to.
Well, my question would be, with some of the shifting landscape and some of the successes we've seen, what unique capacity does Canada, and what should we be mindful of? How can we help play a role in helping ensure that some of those positive advances continue, and/or that we address some of the gaps with the way that the landscape is shifting? Whether it be on the GAI, the role of peacekeepers, just as two examples. And maybe, I don't know.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
No, what were you going to say?
I was just gonna.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Yeah, as a response, I will also add a few more points to the progress that support that, that Canada supported, and it's a beautiful segue. Well, as far as I'm concerned.
I just realized we made a major mistake in the agenda. We put an hour for this panel. We should have put 2. So.
Yeah, no, so I would like to speak about the localization program, and not just, I hope, you're not thinking that I'm just tooting my own horn, but it was cited by the Secretary General in the last 5 years as a best practice example, and also highlighted in the 2015 Global Review. So the localization program is actually taking the National Action Plan or the resolutions out of New York, out of the capital, and bringing it to local communities and shaped in a way that responds to the realities of the local communities. So governors, mayors, local councilors, and local civil society, especially women's groups and youth groups, work together either to integrate it in their local development plans. I don't know if you have a similar thing in Canada, but in most countries we work in, it's now in 11 countries. There's a local development plan that includes everything from agriculture, education, environment, health and sanitation, etc. It's their blueprint for what they do in their city or municipality. And what we've observed is that most of those local development plans are either gender blind or peace blind, even if there's a national action plan. So the national action plan is here, floating somewhere in the capital, but not integrated into the work of local authorities and the local civil society. So that's what localization is about. And I'm happy and very thankful to say that Canada was the first donor to the localization, which was implemented in Burundi, Sierra Leone, and Nepal. It's now in 11 countries, going on 15. So that's one thing that Canada contributed. And also, the adoption of Resolution 2250 on youth, peace, and security in December 2015, which also Canada supports, needs to be, those who are in national action planning processes need to reflect on how to integrate 2250 in the national action plans on 1325. So, focusing on Canada, we're beyond grateful to Canada for being one of the early supporters of 1325. When you mentioned it yourself, when you were a member of the Security Council in 2000, it's one of the countries, along with Namibia and Bangladesh, that really championed the adoption within the Security Council. And because of that, we got the unanimous adoption from all the Security Council members. And then the coordination of the Group of Friends of 1325, which translated into Group of Friends of Women, Peace, and Security, when Resolution 1820 was adopted, Canada has, continuously supported that and still remains as the coordinator. And the Group of Friends is a very powerful, although informal structure in terms of getting all of the other member states to support this agenda. Although sometimes when we ask them, there's about 50 members now of the Group of Friends. So how are you supporting the Women, Peace, and Security agenda? Oh, we're a member of the Friends. So, it can also be, an excuse for some inactive member states. The other areas where Canada can still can make a huge difference is in leading the realization of the sustaining peace concept. This is a new concept. developed around the review, the 3 reviews, and it's about responding to conflict by working not only in countries that are currently having conflict or just emerged from conflict, but those who are still challenged, even though they have emerged from conflict for a long time. So in many ways, it's also a response to the intersection, or the call for the intersection between the Sustainable Development Goals and the Women, Peace and Security resolutions. As you know, we achieved a lot in the new Sustainable Development Goals with the adoption of Goal 16 on peaceful and inclusive society, because before, in the MDGs, that was the biggest gap. There's nothing on peace and security in the Millennium Development Goals. As if you can achieve sustainable development without peace, or as if you can have peace without sustainable development. They're part of the same equation. They're equal part of the same equation. So that's one thing that Canada can support. And I see already a beginning commitment from Canada on supporting the concept of sustaining peace. There was a panel during the recent CSW that Canada and Bangladesh hosted. And I was like, they're actually going back to their partnership in their commitment to this agenda and broadening it. And it's still controversial for a number of member states, especially conflict-affected member states, because the thinking is that, the funding and support for us, conflict-affected member states, will be taken away because the agenda is being broadened. And then some developing countries who are not directly affected by conflict are saying the same. The support or the funding for development will now be taken away to support those, more of those who are emerging from conflict. So it's controversial on both ends. And I think Canada can show leadership by, again, this is not about siloing development and peace from each other. It's a more holistic approach. Sustaining peace is a more holistic approach. And then I think Canada should also think about focusing on countries or regions that are not the pet countries, that are not donor darlings already by a lot of donor countries. And and actually I'm happy to see when I had meeting with Peace Ops that the Philippines is one of their priority countries now, although second tier. A lot of countries have dropped the Philippines as a priority country for this agenda, because we've signed an agreement, or you've lived with that conflict for 50 years. You don't need our support. It's not a priority. It's not affecting international peace and security.
Great.
So, yes.
I want to leave some time for audience questions, and I want to have Jackie have a chance to tackle this as well. So thanks, Matt. Those are some good diplomatic priorities, and I heard in there sort of funding strategically, being an early donor to get in, and that there are linkages between the SDGs and the Women, Peace and Security Network that would be really important for Canada to explore. There were some of the groups I heard this morning were also talking about the issue of focus countries, of doing that. So maybe that's something we can explore in the afternoon. But Jackie, I want to give you a chance to talk about what's Canada's niche in this concept.
Beth the Hammer, got it. Thank you. I'll be quick. I have to start. There's quote a great Canadian scholar. Many of you know him as Austin Powers, Mike Myers, who says there's no more adamant Canadian than a Canadian who lives outside of the country. I fall completely in that camp. And so what it leads me to do living outside of Canada is to think constantly about your exact question about what is Canada's niche, what's our comparative advantage, how are we unique and different and special? I mean, I know all these, I know why we're special. What are your unique and comparative advantages? Want to make a point though before I talk about a few of them, which is more of like a cautionary note about the risk of becoming overly niche-y, I guess you could say, in your National Action Plan. And the reason I say that is I've seen a whole lot of countries pick real, somewhat narrow priority areas or conflict focal countries, some to some success, and then some where a higher priority emerges, a change in government happens, and you want a new leader who wants to make have a different brand or mark for him or herself. You have a crisis like Ebola emerge, for example, in Sierra Leone that becomes the #1 security, health, biggest crisis in the country, and the National Action Plan immediately, to some people, seemed irrelevant. Same, we were just talking about European NAPS, the refugee crisis. So I think you want to have a National Action Plan that is specific enough to be meaningful, but I've seen too many countries, I think, get carried away with the concept of a niche. That said, I think Canada's niche could actually be getting the concept that this is a holistic issue. So we, right now, would actually stand out in the world of national action plans and our international engagement by recognizing the connections between women's leadership at grassroots levels and grassroots organizations, their participation in security forces, their participation in governance, and the connection of those things to a whole range of security issues. And I think one of the most important elements of understanding the holistic nature of this is really focusing on women leaders in local contexts. I've said this many times, so many of you have said it as well, that Canada's job never is and never should be or never will be to assert women's rights in countries around the world. It's to enable women themselves to hold their own governments accountable. And that, I think, I would argue, should be the objective of the National Action Plan, is to recognize the capacity of women around the world to be leaders within their own communities and enable that. And so supporting grassroots women's movements, women's organizations, not in a project-based way, not in a sort of deliver this one set of workshops, et cetera, but really supporting authentic women's movements and leadership in local communities is a niche that Canada can fulfill. And when you think about many of our comparative advantages and our unique positions, Canadian diplomats and humanitarian workers often have more mobility in countries than many other organizations or governments from major donor countries. So you're actually able to connect more and learn with and understand more grassroots or local women's movements. The Gambia, elsewhere, you have a much better upfront view of what people want and need. Canada has a good reputation, I would say, especially now. I know it's probably a tired topic here, but internationally, Justin Trudeau is a really big deal, and people really associate Canada with feminism these days, so, build on that. And then also, overall, Canada contributes relatively smaller amounts of money than many other organizations, and with grassroots or local women's organizations and movements, small amounts of money have a disproportionate or outsized impact, so that's something that's really important that can be done. And then secondly, on training of security forces and understanding of this issue within security institutions, I literally, and I'm not exaggerating, I walk around the streets of DC with the CDS directive on women, peace, and security. When I read it, it was like my heart was gonna explode. It's one of the most, we can look for areas of improvement, et cetera, but it's one of the most comprehensive, beautiful documents I've ever seen about a department saying, this is not negotiable anymore, this is core to our strategy, and we simply must do it. Now get on with it. And that's the tone I think that many security institutions need to have, and that's what the CDS directive has, as well as a whole lot of RCMP training and training of other organizations, other police services. So as the world is focusing now on how do we actually operationalize this agenda, Canada's security forces, military and police, I think have a whole lot to offer in terms of curriculum and capacity in that regard. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Jackie.